Good evening. Welcome to our Training Tuesdays for the Baltimore-Washington Conference. Tonight we are talking about the role of the trustees in your local church. I am John Strawbridge. I'm the chair of trustees for the conference trustees for the Baltimore-Washington Conference. But more importantly for tonight's session, I am also a member of my local church trustees. My local church is Lovely Lane United Methodist Church in Baltimore City, and I've been on the board of trustees there for 10 or more years, dealing with the realities of building maintenance and building use and the kinds of things that you have to deal with on the local church. And I'll share some of those experiences with you as well. I also have the honor to be on the board of trustees for the Strawbridge Shrine. So a fair amount of experience dealing with the kinds of different kinds of properties, older properties, newer properties. And it's my pleasure to be with you here tonight and hopefully tell you a little bit about what you can expect as a member of the Board of Trustees for your local church, give you some background from the Book of Discipline and from some other sources, and give you some strategies for how to face the role and the service that you're giving to your local church, a service that's greatly appreciated because that's an important ministry in the life of your church to keep your building and your congregation ready for the work of transforming the world and creating disciples for Jesus Christ. I want to give you a brief overview of what the session is going to look like tonight so you can be prepared for the kinds of things that are coming up. So we're going to begin by talking about the Board of Trustees, what it is, where its authority comes from, what describes what the Board of Trustees is and what they do. And we're going to talk about what are the duties of the Board of Trustees in a little bit more detail. We're going to take some time for questions throughout the session. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. And if you're watching live with us, you can click on that button. You can submit your questions. And when we have an opportunity to take a break, I have some partners here in the studio who are helping me manage those questions, and they'll feed your questions to me as we can answer those as we go along. So if you have questions, feel free to click that Q&A button and enter those questions as you have them. We're also going to continue to talk about the Board of Trustees as a ministry of the church and some of the things that are a little bit less black and white, but what you can do as a trustee to be in ministry in your church, to support the ministry and to support the work of your church in ways that maybe aren't necessarily written out in a book, but ways that you can be more creative and more kind of inspired as a trustee to go beyond kind of the basic duties of the Board of Trustees. We're going to have some resources for you. It's easy to be overwhelmed because there's going to be a lot of text we're going to present for you and a lot of facts and figures and a lot of different kinds of things to think about. So there are resources that will be available for you. The first is our Book of Discipline. Every church, every Board of Trustees should have a copy of the Book of Discipline. That's available through Cokesbury, as well as some other sources. There's also a series of training manuals that we're referring to throughout this series. There's a manual on trustees. That's a fairly thin book. It's only a few dollars. That's also available through Cokesbury, and we'll make those links available for you at the end of the session. But both of those are very good resources to have to kind of prepare yourself and to be able to constantly kind of look back to help you be the Board of Trustees. I also wanted you to look at the Baltimore-Washington Conference as a resource for you. We don't want you going through this alone. This is not, if you're just joining the Board of Trustees, this is not something that you're kind of just cast to the wind. We have resources available on the conference website. There's ways to contact me as the chair of the conference trustees. There's other resources available for you. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, don't feel like you have to go it alone. Look at the conference website, find some of those resources that are going to be available for you. So let's begin by talking about what is a trustee. And I want to talk about that in two different ways. And first, I'm going to talk about what it is from the Book of Discipline. That is, of course, our primary organizing document. And that gives us a lot of guidelines onto what we should be doing and thinking about as a Board of Trustees. But I also want to look at what Maryland law has to say about the Board of Trustees, because there are some aspects of being a trustee that are not necessarily exclusive to the work of the church that have implications legally and outside the sort of church rules. It may be different. I know a lot of you have churches in the District of Columbia or in West Virginia or outside the state of Maryland. But Maryland in particular has very specific language about what trustees. So I want to share some of that with you as we go through this evening. So let's begin with the Book of Discipline and what that has to say about the trustees. It has to say quite a lot about the trustees, and there's a lot of text that describes the Board of Trustees. And I want to highlight just a couple of portions for you to talk about so you can help understand what the Book of Discipline is saying about the trustees. So the first is that the trustees are subject to the direction of the charge conference. The Board of Trustees shall have the supervision, oversight, and care of all real property owned by the local church, and of all property and equipment acquired directly by the local church or by any society, board, class, commission, or similar organization. And now, being a rule book, there's a lot of that kind of language in the Book of Discipline, but if you take a moment to study it, it begins to make sense. So this is the first thing that you probably already understand about being a trustee, is that you've got oversight of the physical property of the land and the grounds and the building of your church. But I also want to point out, also in the same paragraph, trustees shall not prevent or interfere with the pastor in the use of any of the said property for religious services or other proper meetings, or permit the use of said property for religious or other meetings without the consent of the pastor. So what I want you to be aware of is that you are in partnership with your pastor. You have a special relationship. As the Board of Trustees, you have a lot of authority and responsibility for your building and for your property, but you're expected to be partners with your pastor. The primary purpose of that building is to be a place of religious service, of worship, of spiritual retreat, of services such as funerals and weddings, things that are baptisms. So think about how you can be working with your pastor to support the ministry of the church and the work that needs to happen in that building, in addition to the things that you're going to have to do, like changing light bulbs and fixing electricity and plumbing. There's a few other aspects of the trustees' duties that I want to highlight from the Book of Discipline, not in quite such detail, but I'm just going to summarize. So the Book of Discipline also says that the trustees should conduct an annual review of insurance. And in a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit more detail, but I just want you to kind of get these topics first of all, and then we'll go into some more detail about what these mean. Use of the property needs to be consistent with the social principles. So again, that's another resource you're going to want to look at, what the social principles of the denomination are, and what that means for how you use your property or who you allow to use your property. The trustees should conduct an annual review of the parsonage. Not every church has a parsonage, but if you do, the trustees are responsible for that property as much as any other. And they should be subject to the direction of the charge conference. Receive and administer all bequests, all trusts, invest all trusts, and it's encouraged to do this according to the social principles. So you see here, there's also a different kind of property that you're dealing with, financial property of the church. And again, we'll go into more detail about that, but you're going to have some financial and administrative duties along with the physical property of the church as well. And then you also should be conducting an annual accessibility audit. See how your building is accessible for people who have different mobility means. So that's sort of a summary of what the Book of Discipline has to say about being a trustee. And I'll come back into some more detail about that, and I'll take your questions about some of those. But I also want to talk a little bit about what the state of Maryland, what the state law says about being a trustee. So it's actually written into, in Maryland, the state code about corporations, specifically religious corporations, that reference specifically what it means to be a trustee. So I don't want to go over all the details because there's a lot of law, and I've only summarized some of them in our slides here. But in particular, notice that it says, hold interest in any asset in the state. So in other words, as the Board of Trustees, you are the Board of Directors of your corporation. And we'll talk later about whether or not you need to incorporate or whether your church is incorporated. But understand that in state law, you are kind of the body that has control of that holds that property and has responsibility for it. And it also says, generally manage any assets of the religious corporation. So again, that speaks to the idea of the trustees as also kind of a board of directors for your church, operating under the authority of the charge conference still, but you have this sort of legal responsibility within the state to be the managers of the corporation of your church. You see there's a lot of other specifics there that relate to the trustees. But a lot of that overlaps what's already in the discipline. But those are the kind of points that I want you to be aware of. There's other specific duties spelled out in the state law, that you keep an accurate record book, that you allow inspection of the record book by members of the corporation, and allow the proceedings recorded to be presented before a public meeting. So in other words, so that's again, it's not just good practice, it's not just the practice of our conference or our denomination, but it's actually a matter of legal practice that you need to be keeping good records and being good stewards of your church's sort of real and financial property. The state law of Maryland, actually, and specifically, it actually references the United Methodist Church in particular, and has things to say about being trustees of a United Methodist Church. So within the state law, it says a religious corporation subject to this may be incorporated only in conformity with the discipline of the United Methodist Church as authorized and declared by the General Conference of the Church. So the state law actually reinforces the discipline in this and says that as a trustee, you must be in conformity with the discipline and how it organizes your board of trustees. And then below it says trustees as directors. As to a religious corporation subject to this part, the trustees of the church shall be the directors of the religious corporation.
John, we want to stop and just do a check-in. We are getting some questions from several of our viewers that say they are having difficulty with the slides. So what we want to do is give you an opportunity to get a drink of water. We want to check our technical connections to make sure that all is as it ought be. So so for those of you who are out there listening, please let us know if you are now seeing the slides by letting us know through the question and answer portal. Just go to questions and answers and let us know if you are now accessing the slides. Okay, thank you. It appears that there is some technical glitch and we are seeing them on our end, but for some reason they are not coming through on your end. All righty, we're going to invite John to continue with this valuable information. We're continuing to work on the visuals on this end. Thank you.
Okay.
Someone says that they are loading. So it may not be on our end, it may be in the system itself.
Okay,
Okay, John.
And if we don't get these loaded for the presentation, they'll be available on the website following. So you have a chance to review them there. And frankly, the slides that you get at the moment, it's a lot of words that I'm trying to summarize for you. So don't worry about that. Really, the concept that I want you to get from all of this, the rules and the discipline of the Maryland law, and particularly this last part about Maryland law, is that there's more to being a trustee than just kind of being custodians of the building. And that's going to take up a lot of your time. There's going to be a lot of time, as I said, when they're coming to you with broken plumbing, broken lights, whatever the physical needs of the property are. But there is this larger duty in which both within the discipline and the state law, that you are the directors of the corporation. And that's an important duty and it's an important responsibility. Again, it's much appreciated. This is something that needs to be done to support the work of the church and understand that that has great meaning, both to the church and to the state. And the last aspect of this, the legal aspect of it that I want to highlight, is in the state law, it talks about the holding of property, and it basically reinforces the trust clause that, again, we're going to talk about later in the presentation. But it says, even within Maryland state law, that your property shall be held by the trustees in trust for the United Methodist Church, subject to the discipline, usage, and ministerial appointments of the United Methodist Church, as from time to time authorized and declared by the General Conference. So again, the state law really reinforces what the church and what the disciplines say about how the trustees are organized to conduct their business. So let's look at how the trustees are organized. And if you've just gone through your charge conference, you have some new people appointed to the trustees. Let's talk about how the Book of Discipline tells us we should build the Board of Trustees. So your trustees are nominated by your Committee on Nominations and are approved at the charge conference or church conference that you probably have just been through. You should have not more than 9, but not fewer than 3 trustees. At least 1/3 of your trustees should be laymen. At least 1/3 should be lay women. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 50-50, but you have to make sure that at least 1/3 of your trustees are men, or at least 1/3 are women. And 2/3 must be professing members of the United Methodist Church. So it may surprise you to learn that 1/3 of your trustees actually don't have to be members of the United Methodist Church. It'll take just a moment. So I think we've got picture back. We're working through our technical, there's a lot more activity here than you may be seeing through your camera as our trustees of the studio are working to make our property work for you. The makeup of the Board of Trustees, you may find that there are times when there's people that you would like to be members of your board who bring certain skills, whether it's legal or real estate or contracting, something that may be of use to your board. So up to 1/3 of your members don't actually have to be members of the church. It is best practice to make sure that you have youth representation on your Board of Trustees. And your Board of Trustees should be in 3-year terms, with those terms staggered so that they overlap. Now, if you are new to the Board of Trustees, you have to elect officers to your Board of Trustees. And that has to happen within 30 days of January 1st, which is the beginning year of your trustee year. And you have to elect a chair, a vice chair, a secretary, and a treasurer. And very often the treasurer is going to be the treasurer of your local church. The chairperson must be a member of your local church. We said that some of your trustees can be outside the local church, but the chairperson does have to be a member of your local church. Very often people wonder about the pastor. Is the pastor a member of the Board of Trustees? So the pastor sits in on the Board of Trustees with voice but no vote, unless you elect your pastor as part of your charge conference to be one of your trustees, the Board of Trustees. So you can elect the pastor at the charge conference, but otherwise the pastor has a voice but no vote. There are other kinds of trustees that might serve. If you have a multi-point charge, there can be a circuit charge trustees. There can be parish trustees for cooperative or multi-point charges, and how those work are spelled out in the Book of Discipline. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but if you have a multi-point charge, you might want to consult the Book of Discipline for how you relate the trustees of those different charges.
You know, one of the questions that has come from one of our listeners is, as you're talking about trustees, one person wants to know if a member of the Board of Trustees is a contractor, can they bid on work in their local church?
So I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule about that. It's definitely something that you should think about, because that person may have some inside information, may have sort of bidding process. But as your Board of Trustees, you have control over sort of creating that process, over answering to your charge conference. One of the things that we're going to discover as we go over our some of our duties here is that you do have a duty to report what you're doing to your charge conference, to your church council. So you want to make sure that you're doing practices that are going to be received well by the church at large, that are fair and that are in the best interest of your church. So I would think as long as that person's part of several bids that you get, that it's an open and transparent process and that you can report that fully to your charge conference, it's not against the rules, but I think you're wise to look closely at that as to whether or not that's something that's going to be entirely fair in the bidding process. Do we have other questions on this part before we move on? I want to move on to talk about the duties, but if there are.
Well, why don't you go ahead?
All right.
People are engaging us,
Okay.
and they're hanging in there, and we're grateful for that.
We appreciate that as we work through our issues here. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the duties of the trustees and how that kind of translates from sort of a set of rules to what you actually need to do in your local church. So let's talk about that in three different ways. So let's first talk about property, which is the thing that most people first think about in terms of the duties of the trustees. So the first is to sort of survey your property. And the Book of Discipline outlines several ways in which you need to do this as far as an accessibility audit. But generally be aware, make sure that you have a regular program of going through your building, of checking if there are roof leaks, checking if all the plumbing is working, checking that the plugs are working. One of the things that we found recently on the conference level with the trustees is we actually had we found that having a home inspection, even if you're not selling the building, it revealed a lot that was worth taking care of or looking at. So that's something you might actually consider doing, is having an inspector come in, look at your building for things that may not be immediately evident, and things that you might need to take care of. When you're doing your survey, look at things like fire exits, whether they're clear. I was at one church recently where they had the fire exit, but it was blocked by folding chairs that had just gotten stuck in that hallway. So sort of look at your building, both from an emergency perspective and from a safety perspective and a maintenance perspective, and make sure you're aware of all the aspects of your property and what might need to attend to before it becomes a problem. Look at the maintenance aspects of your building. Very often trustees get to the point where they're just kind of reacting to one problem after another. So really look at the maintenance of your building in sort of preventative terms of what do we need to attend to before it becomes a problem. What in the building is getting a little bit to the end of its lifespan? What in the building is maybe just beginning to wear, or is maybe just out of date in terms of the current technology or the current practice. So look at the maintenance of your building before you have a problem about certain things. Look at the service contracts, the people that you may have on a regular basis, whether it's pest control, whether it's elevator maintenance, whether it's taking care of your musical instruments, your organ, your roof, whatever it is. Look at those service contracts. Routinely look at whether or not they are still the best contracts for you, or whether or not you should maybe renegotiate those or relook at maybe things have changed in your building. Maybe you've added some things or closed off some things. So are those service contracts still serving you in the best way possible? So look at those, try to look at those annually, maybe in the beginning of your trustee year, and make sure that you're getting the best deal for those service contracts that you have. Look at the accessibility and safety, as I mentioned. Make sure that fire exits are clear, that they're clearly marked. This is the kind of thing we don't like to talk about often in church. And I've actually, as the lay leader of my church, even during morning announcements, taken a time to talk about fire exits and fire safety, which is, it can be kind of awkward in the beginning of a worship service, but I realize that people may not be aware of where fire exits are, of where fire extinguishers are, if you have an AED emergency device, where that is. So be looking at those kinds of safety and accessibility aspects of your building. You're also supposed to be looking annually at your insurance. And there's different kinds of insurance that you need to look at. Of course, you need to look at your property insurance. Are you adequately covered for today's rates? Have you kind of let that fall by the wayside? You need to look again at what the cost and what the value of your property is. Do you need to renegotiate that? My church had great success in the past year at renegotiating our property insurance, and actually reduced our price by a few $1,000s, which any church could use a few thousand. So be looking at that insurance and whether or not that coverage is current and at your best levels. You also want to look at liability insurance. Make sure that you and the people that work at the church are properly covered for any kind of liability situations. You need to look at your workers' compensation policy. Make sure that the employees of your church are covered, and that typically annually your insurance company is going to want a report on the hours and the salaries of your workers. So make sure that all is up to date. Whether you have sexual misconduct insurance, there's other kinds of things you could look at. There's even terrorism insurance that your insurance company may want you to consider. So be looking annually at your insurance policies, whether you are adequately covered and whether or not you're getting your best deal on those insurance policies.
John, how often should the building be inspected? I mean, is there a regular schedule? Is there guidance on that in the discipline, or is that determined at each local church level?
That's not specified in the discipline, but it's definitely something that you should be making a practice of in your trustees. If you don't currently have a policy of what that should be, that's something that maybe you should do in one of your early meetings in January, is figure out what that schedule should be. For me, that an annual review of these kinds of things is good. Certainly, there's certain things that the discipline wants us to look at annually. That insurance, the accessibility, the parsonage, those things have to be looked at annually by the discipline. These other things, it's up to you to create the policy. And I really urge you to be proactive in that, because so many churches kind of only react to those things after they become a problem. So you need to set your policy and figure out what your schedule is. And it's better to be more on top of that than to let it go. This also goes to the idea that the Book of Discipline doesn't even specify how often trustees should meet. You have to meet at least once a year. To me, that's a slightly terrifying thought, even though it's within the Book of Discipline, that you would only meet once a year. Many trustees meet quarterly, but are probably very active in those months between their quarterly meetings, sort of doing email meetings or meeting after worship services to look at and take care of the kinds of things that you need to take care of. Here on the conference level, we meet monthly, and sometimes that's not even enough. So again, you need to be setting your policies and your schedules for what really works for your church and your congregation. But again, to not be surprised by the things that might come up for you.
What's the minimum age for a trustee to be legal?
So to be legal, you have to be at least 18 years of age. It is still encouraged that you have a youth representative on your trustees, but a trustee should be, except for your youth representative, should be 18 years of age. Other kinds of things that you want to be looking at in terms of property issues is, and again, this is another policy kind of thing, is your building use. It can be a good source of income. It can be a good ministry for your building to make your building available to community groups and people that might rent your building and use it. At my local church, we have mission groups that come and stay overnight. We have a local dance group. We have the community association meets there. We have artists that do shows there. So there's a lot that's going on in the building, and a lot that you can do with your building to be a blessing to your community and to be a witness, to be out in your community, to make people aware that you are there, that you are part of the community, that you're a resource for them. But as a trustee, you should be looking at what the policies are for the use of that building and not just kind of say, wow, we're getting a little bit of rental income, that's great. Because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you haven't really planned in advance and thought about what the policies for your building use should be. So look at things like how you make reservations, how far in advance those reservations need to be made for a group that wants to use your building. Look at the differences between how a member of your congregation, what the rules apply to them, how that may be different from another nonprofit that wants to use your building versus a group that may not be a nonprofit. You really need to be looking at certificates of insurance. And so this is a point I want to make very clearly. Any group that comes in to use your building should have a certificate of insurance naming your church as co-insured. And that's very particular language, so let me repeat it. They need to give you a certificate of insurance naming your church as co-insured. A lot of times groups might balk at this, it seems difficult, but if they've got insurance themselves, to get a certificate of insurance should take only about a day. It usually costs maybe $30. Sometimes it doesn't cost anything. So it's actually really not a difficult thing for these groups to get, but it's really essential for you as a church to protect yourself that these groups come in, that they have a proper insurance and that you're covered for what their event, for whatever might go on in their event. So you really need to be looking at that certificate of insurance for any group that is using your building. You also have to look at the policies that you need to enforce for groups that are coming into your building. As the United Methodist Church, we don't allow alcohol in the building. That takes care of a lot of wedding receptions that might want to use our social hall, but we do have a no alcohol in the premises policy. And look at other things that, again, I direct you to sort of our social principles of uses that may be appropriate for your building. And as always, be in ministry with your pastor, that he or she is weighing in on the use of your building whether or not that interferes with the ministry use of your building, and whether or not the groups that might want to use your building are appropriate to be within your building. Look at how this use of building impacts your cleaning. Do you need to bring in additional cleaning help? Do you need to have additional days? Do you need to charge a cleaning fee for the groups that are using your buildings? And then the last thing that I want to touch on, and this is probably something that a lot of you will have questions about and actually can get a little bit complicated, but the question of whether or not you have to pay tax on income that you get from the use of your building. And our first advice on this is always consult an accountant, because it does get complicated. But let me try to give you the highlights of this to simplify it a little bit. So a lot of people think that because you're a nonprofit, because you're a church, any income that you get shouldn't be taxable. And that's not actually true. The IRS has what they call unrelated business income tax, or UBIT. And that's their way of saying any income that you get that's not directly related to your mission as a nonprofit, as a church, can actually be subject to tax. Another way to look at that is if somebody else in another business gets taxed for doing that, then you should as well. So this comes up a lot in terms of renting parsonages. There's a lot of church have parsonages that the pastor doesn't live in, and they want to rent that parsonage to a family as a source of income. Now, renting property is something that other businesses do for profit. They pay tax on the money they get from renting a parsonage. So for the IRS, it's unfair for a church to be able to do that without paying tax. So if you're renting a parsonage not to your pastor, then that could be taxable income. Some exceptions to that are things like a car wash that you might do as a fundraiser, or a spaghetti supper. So even though there are professional car washes, even though there are restaurants that serve spaghetti, they're doing it on a regular basis, whereas you're doing that as a one-time thing, specifically for the purposes of fundraising. So those kinds of fundraisers are exempt, and the money that you make from a spaghetti supper or a car wash is not going to be subject to that tax. But you need to look at regular use of your building that may not be directly related to your ministry, because it could get into a situation where that does become taxable income. The laws that relate to that go through many, many pages with a number of exceptions. So again, I go back to our first advice, which is consult an accountant. If you have an accountant you work with regularly, or if not, as a situation like that comes up, maybe spend a little extra and get the opinion of that accountant. But don't just assume that because you're a church, any income you get is not taxable. It can be taxable. So as the Board of Trustees, I urge you to be aware of that and to be thinking about what you can do legally with the use of building for your church. Going back to the parsonage, again, we know that you should be annually surveying your parsonage, and your district administrator, if you don't have it, can provide for you a list of things that you should be looking at with your parsonage, things that we are supposed to be attentive to make a parsonage ready for a pastor and their family. So make sure that's part of your regular maintenance. Parsonages get put off a lot. That's one of the things that trustees really don't like to deal with. Don't do that to your pastor. Make sure that your parsonage is taken care of, is in good shape, and is in good livable condition. And again, look for that, the policies that I think your district administrator could provide for you. I also want you to think about a best practice for managing your property, which is to develop life of policies or funding. So in other words, not waiting for that carpet to wear out, not waiting for that hole in the roof, not waiting for those windows to start to leak, but beginning to set aside money now that will go towards the replacement of those things that you know have a certain limited lifespan, a reserve fund that can take care of those building needs. For instance, maybe this year you put down new carpeting throughout the sanctuary, and you know that that carpeting costs $10,000 or whatever it costs. And the expected life term of that carpeting is going to be maybe 20 years. So you know in 20 years, you're going to have that expense again. So you should be thinking about, okay, how do we set aside the money now and for the next 20 years that's going to go to replace that thing that we know is going to be wearing out at that time. So that's something that you do have the power to do and should be working with your charge conference and church council to do, is to set up these policies, both policy as terms of what you do as a practice, but also as an actual account where you create this reserve fund to replace the things that you know are going to have a limited lifespan. So let's talk a little bit about changes to your property. that may happen. And there are some specific rules in the Book of Discipline about what you have to do if you want to build additions or make changes to your property. So in general, some of those rules are that if you're going to purchase or acquire property, a friend had a church where they were able to suddenly buy the property next door to increase their parking lot size. But there are rules that govern how that have to happen. So that requires a charge conference. So you need to notify your district superintendent that you would like to have a charge conference. And this action has to be brought before the charge conference. That's not something that the trustees can decide on their own. It's not even something the administrative board of your church could decide on their own. It has to happen at a charge conference. You have to give notice of that meeting at least 10 days from the pulpit, and in the church bulletin, the church newsletter, whatever your regular means of communication are, you have to give notice of that meeting at least 10 days in advance. And that notice must state the action to be voted on. In other words, whatever that actual motion that you're going to vote on, that wording has to be in that notice that you let people know about. If you are acquiring new property, then the deed for that property must include the trust clause, which is spelled out in the Book of Discipline. And I'll go over that again in a little bit. And again, you have to get approval from your district committee on buildings and locations. And that's a step that a lot of people bypass because they're simply not aware of the role of the district committee on buildings and locations. But make sure that you're consulting them and really use that committee as a resource. That's not necessarily somebody that are going to come in and try to limit what you can do or kind of rain on your parade. It's really a good resource that each district has a committee on buildings and locations. Be in touch with them whenever you want to make these kinds of changes or purchases and get their advice for the best way to do that and what you have to do to be in conformity with the discipline. Now, if you want to sell, transfer, or mortgage your property, the same kind of rules apply. It has to be done by a charge conference. Notice must be given. The action to be taken has to be spelled out. It has to be approved by the district committee. But you also need to get the signature of your pastor and your district superintendent on anything that is going to either create a mortgage or dispose of property, either by sale or some other kind of transfer. Keep in mind that if you are selling a parsonage, if you've decided to go to a housing allowance and you're no longer going to keep that parsonage, the money from the sale of that parsonage can only be used either for the purchase of another parsonage or to support the pastor's housing fund. You can't take that money and help you make a budget shortfall or another use. The money from the sale of a parsonage can only be used for another parsonage or for the housing fund. If you're considering a job that will build an addition or do a significant remodeling to your building, the Book of Discipline also asks you to do a study and report to your charge conference what the plan of action is, why you're taking that action, and what you expect the impact to be. And that's in the Book of Discipline, paragraph 2544. So if you're looking at a big project like that, consult the Book of Discipline about what you need to do. Know that any action that requires more than 10% of the value of your property requires the approval of the district committee on buildings and locations. So if you look at the budget of that project and it's more than 10% of the total value of your property, that's something that you have to get the approval of that district committee on buildings and locations and the signature of the pastor and the district superintendent, as well as following those procedures that we said above of the 10-day notice and action by the charge conference. So that's kind of an overview of the duties. Do we have questions that have come in about that in particular before we move on to some of the financial aspects?
Folks are really appreciating this information. Some of them, however, really wanted you to, if possible, quote the entire section of the discipline where those particular things are found. And one would have to be an expert on the entire discipline because all of that's not neatly packaged line after line after line. But can you help them? Because some of these folks are not yet trustees.
Sure.
These are folks who are going to be coming on the trustees and really trying to find their way.
Okay. So I will go back to something I said, that really the best way to find a lot of this is that trustee manual that's published summarizes most of the relevant passages from the Book of Discipline in a booklet that's only about 20 or 30 pages. I say that booklet costs, I think, about $3.99 on Cokesbury. It's really a great and easy thing to do. And so for most of the things that I'm quoting, you're going to find them quoted in that little book. As Reverend Rodney said, the things they are kind of spread out. The Book of Discipline, and I never travel without my Book of Discipline. So a lot of them are summarized under aspects of the local church. I mentioned a moment ago paragraph 2544. So around those 2,500 paragraphs, 2530 through 2540s. Right now, what I'm talking about right now, the sale, transfer, or lease, that's paragraph 2515. So they're spread out through there. But look, if you have a Book of Discipline, go to those 2,500 passages that relate to the local church, and you'll see a lot of that information. But really, I encourage you to get that trustee manual because that helps, and that really summarizes all those things together. We've got a fair amount of time tonight, but I don't know that I've got time to quote all of those passages of the discipline. I think your eyes would start to water a little bit, but it's an excellent question. I appreciate that you're looking for the detail, because a lot of people, their eyes just glaze over when they look at the Book of Discipline, because it's a lot of language, but don't be intimidated by it. Once you've read it through a few times, it begins to make sense.
You have already answered this, but maybe we need to take another stab at it. The question is, how do elected corporate officers relate to the Board of Trustees?
So they would be your Board of Trustees, really. It shouldn't be two different things. So if your church is locally incorporated, then those officers would be your Board of Trustees, or your Board of Trustees would be the officers of that corporation. If your church is not incorporated, and I'm jumping ahead of my notes a little bit, then the Board of Trustees is basically your corporate entity for that church, and that's the group that's going to sign contracts and be legally responsible for those legal things. So if you are separately incorporated, your Board of Trustees is your Board of Directors of that corporation.
Thank you.
So, and again, we'll have other times for questions later. So if there are other questions you have about property and best practices for looking after your property, we can certainly address those. Let me touch on two more aspects of being a trustee. And the one is the financial aspect. So let's talk a little bit about that, because this is what people don't necessarily think of. They think of property in terms of buildings and grounds and lands and cemeteries. We haven't talked about cemeteries yet, but that's a whole other aspect of dealing with property. But there's also the property that it is in terms of trusts and bequests that come into your church. So you're going to have a certain financial oversight of certain property within your church as well. So if you get a trust or a bequest, someone leaves some money to the church in their will, then it's the duty of the trustees to actually receive that trust. And this can get a little confusing because your committee on finance is used to dealing with the finances of the church. And so it can be confusing as to where those overlap. What duties does the committee on finance have? What duties do the trustees have? But it is spelled out in the Book of Discipline that any trusts and any bequests are administered by the Board of Trustees. That's true on the conference level. It's true on the local church level. So, and then the trustees have a duty to administer those funds for the good of the body. They're encouraged to invest those funds. They're encouraged to invest them responsibly according to our social principles. Now, again, the trustees always act under the authority of the charge conference. So the charge conference can set out rules for what happens. And in my church, we've certainly had to do that. Most bequests will come in with a direction. That is, they'll say that I want this to go to the building fund. I want this to go to the youth. At my church, because it's an historic building, we get bequests that specifically go to the restoration account to preserve the historic building. But there may be bequests that come in that are undesignated. The donor hasn't said what they want to do with that. So you need to work to develop policies before that may happen. A policy for what's going to happen to unrestricted bequests, so that it's clear, both for your trustees and in terms of your church's administrative board or church council, what your policies are for receiving those funds and how they're to be used for the good of the church. And again, investment should be considered a part of that. So this is why I want to talk about best practices. Certainly, if you have an ability to create an endowment for your church, some funds that will be invested to return some interest that can help the operating of your church, that's a really great thing to do. And that can be a really long-term strategy for the best management of your church for your generation and for future generations. Now, for a lot of churches, that's a luxury. Maybe you're just making enough money to kind of pay your expenses. But I still want you to think about some best practices, because it's not always the best thing to just react to the emergency. Sometimes you really want to think about planning and putting something aside to give yourself a longer term lifespan. So the trustees can have an account that is their own account that they can use funds for the good of the building and for managing the property. I already talked about a building reserve. That is, that you might want to create an account that specifically goes to the long-term life of the building. Things that you know, if you have a furnace or an air conditioning system that sooner or later is going to break down, you begin putting aside money for that. Sooner or later, the roof is going to need to be replaced. Sooner or later, you're going to need to repaint. There's certain kinds of things that are going to come up on a regular basis. So it's a good practice to create a fund and a policy for taking care of those expected long-term expenses. You may even want to create an emergency fund, something that is unexpected, a sudden leak in the roof, a sudden failure of your furnace, that can respond, that has cash ready, that can respond to those emergencies so that you don't have to cancel Sunday services, so that you can continue to worship and to continue to use your space. You should develop and present a budget to the Committee on Finance for your year's work. That's tedious work. It's not something that somebody always wants to do, but it is something that you should be doing as trustees, is to look at your budget, present that to your Committee on Finance for what you think you're going to need to do for your building maintenance and repair and the good of your building over the year. I also want to mention at this point, whether or not you're incorporated or whether or not you're relying on the denomination. As a 501c3, as a nonprofit company, you may be separately incorporated. Your local church may be incorporated as a nonprofit company. But if not, you benefit from what's called the group ruling. And that is that the General Commission on Finance and Administration for the entire denomination has gotten a group ruling from the IRS that all congregations of the United Methodist Church are covered under their nonprofit. And you may want to get a copy of that. If you go to the website, if you go to the General Commission on Finance and Administration and look for the group ruling letter, you can ask for a copy of that, and they will give you a copy of that letter that specifically references your congregation and lists you as being included in that group ruling, so that you have legal proof that you are a nonprofit entity, even if you're not separately incorporated. So if you don't already have that, if you're not separately incorporated, I encourage you to go to that website for the General Commission on Finance Administration, look for that group ruling letter, and have that documentation for your congregation. You may also want to be looking at your state tax exempt certificate. Those need to be renewed every few years. If you let it expire, it becomes kind of a complicated thing to apply for again. So look at your certificate, see what your expiration date is, and make sure that's in good standing. So that you can take advantage of your nonprofit status.
Where would they find those documents?
The group ruling documents. Again, you want to go to the general church website for the United Methodist Church. Do a search for General Finance and Administration. It's been a couple years since I did this for my own congregation, so I can't give you a roadmap, but I can direct you to do what I did, which is just start searching. Go into the search bar, look for that group ruling, and that'll give you a chance to put in your congregation's information and to get a letter that will be used for your congregation.
So gcfa.org?
Yes.
gcfa.org.
General Commission on Finance and Administration. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Look for that. The other aspect of the trustees that I want to talk about is administrative. And this is a little bit shorter section, but understand that within the Book of Discipline, you have certain administrative duties that are all spelled out. And that is, the trustees are expected to uphold the Book of Discipline. And again, it's a big book with a lot of little writing. But it's something you should, at least for your sections on trustees, become familiar with. That is part of the duties of the trustees, is to uphold that Book of Discipline. To uphold the charter of your local church. So if your local church has a charter, or if you don't know where that is, maybe dig into the vault, try to find that information. But if there are specifics in your charter, then your duty is also to uphold that charter of your local church. And the last is to uphold the local law. So whether you're in the city or whatever county you're in, you actually need to make sure that whatever you do is in compliance, whether it's adding an accessibility ramp, expanding your parking lot, adding onto your building, whatever you do has to be in compliance with your local law and local regulations. So it's really the duty of the trustees to be looking at that to make sure that you're in compliance with the Book of Discipline, your own charter, and the local law. As it relates to that, let me talk specifically about something I mentioned before, which is the trust clause. And this is a big aspect of being a United Methodist, a big aspect of church property, something that you've probably heard about, but let me talk specifically about it. And this one, I will give you the paragraph in your Book of Discipline, paragraph 2503, spells out the trust clause that has to be in any deed. The trust clause has been in our denomination from the very beginning. John Wesley, in our first discipline, 1797, spelled out the trust clause. So this is not something new. It goes back to 1797. It's always been a part of our denomination. It has to be something that's in any contract. It allows us to buy and sell and hold property. And so let me read this out for you. It's a little bit long, not too long, but let me read the trust clause for you. In trust that said premises shall be used, kept, and maintained as a place of divine worship of the United Methodist Ministry and members of the United Methodist Church, subject to the discipline, usage, and ministerial appointments of said church, as from time to time authorized and declared by the General Conference and by the annual conference within whose bounds said premises are situated. This provision is solely for the benefit of the grantee, and the grantor reserves no right or interest in said premises. This is something that is of great interest and a lot of confusion. The question is, well, don't we own the church? We paid for it. We paid the mortgage. We take care of it. Yes, your congregation owns your local church, but it is property that is held in trust for the larger denomination. Recognizing that people who are looking for United Methodist Church, people who are giving to a United Methodist Church, that connection is part of who we are. It's part of our DNA. It's part of who you are as a congregation. So that trust clause guarantees that while it's your building and your property, it's something that you hold in trust for the whole denomination and for the work of the denomination, again, for the transformation of the world by creating disciples through Jesus Christ. That trust clause, if you do buy new property, if you rewrite your deed or anything, that trust clause has to be in the deed. One of the things that I didn't spell out, but even in the Maryland law about trustees, it even says, if that's not in your deed, that doesn't actually exempt it, that it's considered to be in your deed, even if it wasn't originally written in, just by the fact that you are a congregation, that you accept an appointment of the United Methodist Church. The law recognizes that that trust clause is in effect. So that's really kind of central to our understanding of property within the United Methodist Church. A little bit more about some administrative duties of the trustees. You should be looking at your safe sanctuary policies. This is something that I think everyone should be familiar with. If you don't already have a safe sanctuary policy, that's something you want to think about and write. If it's something that you do have, that's something you want to review. Make sure that it is adequate, that it fully protects, that it fully spells out everything that has to do with providing a safe worship experience, providing a safe environment for your youth and for anyone that is working with your youth. So take a moment to look at that safe sanctuary policy, make sure that it is up to date and that it is complete. We mentioned gifts of trust or bequests. So one of your administrative duties is to ensure that gifts to the church are used for the intent of the donor. So you get some income in tithes and offering, things that are put in the plate, offering envelopes that may be mailed in or given another way. Some churches have even gone to online giving, different ways of sort of receiving tithes and offerings. There's an understanding about when people give a gift, whether they're giving for the general fund of the church, the operation of the church, whether you have a building fund, or whether their gift specifies something in particular that they want their gift to go towards. It's your job as a trustee to ensure that the will of that donor is being carried out. And you can't say, well, that's all well and good, but this is what we really need the money for. You actually have a duty to honor the intent of the donor. And there have even been occasions when churches have had to consider whether or not they want to accept that gift because it's an intent that they may not be able to carry out. And that's a reality that you have to look at. If for some reason somebody says, I want to give this money, but only if you build a new chapel. And you look at that and say, well, that's not something that we can do, or it's not something that we want to do. You can't accept that money unless you intend to follow that wishes. So you actually have to look at whether or not you can accept something like that and honor the will of the donor. It is also your administrative duty to keep good records both in terms of your trustee minutes, your financial records, to ensure that those records are being kept and maintained. In my own church, we, some years ago, undertook a big renovation project to take our sanctuary back to how it looked when it opened. And we were able to go back to trustee records dating from the 1800s of when the building was built to look at the minutes, at what they talked about in those meetings. And it enabled us to know a lot about the original construction of that building. So I actually really like to think in terms of the trustees' minutes as something that is being written down for people 100 years from now that don't necessarily know what you all know as a trustees. And when you look at the records you keep, when you look at the minutes you write, you have to kind of separate yourself from knowing what you're talking about and really look at, will someone 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, will they know what we were talking about? And are those records good and complete? And also, as I mentioned, be sure that you are reporting annually to your church council, your administrative board, what the activities of the trustees are. Be as open and upfront as possible about what you're doing, what you're spending, what you think needs to be spent, what you think the church needs to attend to as part of your annual report. And again, remember that you are acting under the direction of your charge conference. So give them the opportunity to have their say about what the trustees should be doing, to let them know what the trustees are doing. Also know that the chair of your trustees is going to represent the board of trustees on some other committees, on the church council and on your committee on finance. So either the chair or the chair can designate, the board can designate somebody else. It doesn't have to be the chair. You can designate who would represent, but you should have representation on those other committees from the board of trustees. So as you're electing your other officers, look at who can be that representative on those committees.
You know, one of the conflicts that often arises in churches is who is really in charge of the church. Is it the church council? Is it the trustees? Is it SBRC? I'm certain that question comes up a lot.
I imagine it would, and it's something that for me is both a matter of the rules, but it's also I have a very personal feeling about this in terms of the United Methodist Church. So because one of the things that's unique about the United Methodist Church is we came from a circuit riding system, what's the word I'm looking for it's left my mind at the moment, but the fact that in our outset, we had pastors who moved around a lot, served in a lot of different churches. So it's really important that as lay people, as trustees, as the administrative board, that you take some ownership of your church, that you take responsibility. I don't think the problem that we have in our churches is that people are trying to resist the pastor too much, although I know that happens. But what I discover as a lay person is that lay people are not taking enough responsibility, for the ministry and direction of their church. So certainly your pastor has certain areas that are absolutely pastoral responsibility. The pastor is responsible for the use of the sanctuary, for the litany, and for the worship style of your church, for anything that relates to those kinds of things. But the trustees have the legal responsibility for the property. And you're the ones that have to sign the contracts and deal with the, if there are negative implications you've got to deal with. So it's not a black, I can't tell you that there's the one person in charge. There are different areas of responsibility. But I do encourage you as trustees and as lay people in general to take that sense of ownership in your church and really be in ministry yourself. It's not just the pastors who are in ministry, we're all in ministry. So really look at what you do to take responsibility for how your building is used, how your building is developed, and how your property supports the mission of the church. But yes, absolutely understand that your pastor has authority over litany, over ritual, over how the sanctuary is used, over who gets to preach, those kinds of things that relate directly to worship and ministry are within the authority of the minister. I hope it doesn't become a question of who's in charge. I hope that you are working really well to develop a good partnership with your pastor, a good partnership with your administrative board. It's really a wonderful thing to have this resource of the church and to be in ministry together. I hope that you enjoy that partnership. I hope you would take advantage of what the United Methodist Church offers to be working together to not be going it alone, as I said earlier, to rely on having those hands there to reach out to take when you need a hand up. So I'm going to take another break for question, but first I want to touch briefly on this idea of incorporation that I mentioned, whether or not you should incorporate your local church. One recommendation for incorporation is the protection of the local church and its officers. So, and I don't want to alarm people with this, but as the Board of Trustees, as the officers of the church, you could be open to some liability if someone decided to sue the church, if there was an unsafe condition at your church that caused injury, anything like that. And by incorporating, you can ensure, and this is something you should be looking at with your insurance policy, is what we call board insurance, that you insure your Board of Trustees that if there is any kind of action taken against your church, that insurance will cover whatever judgment could possibly happen against your church, and that it doesn't fall to your individual church leaders or trustees. So the property of an incorporated church is held in the name of the church, but a property of an unincorporated church is held in the name of the trustees. So if your church is not separately incorporated, then you as the trustees are the corporation of that church. You hold the property, you sign the titles, you sign contracts. If you acquire new property, you are the purchasers of that property. If you mortgage it, you're the people that mortgage it. So understand that there's some level of incorporation, whether or not you're incorporated. It falls to the trustees if the church itself is not separately incorporated. Know that if your church is incorporated, it must be organized and operated according to the discipline of the United Methodist Church. It should prohibit the church from severing its connection to the United Methodist Church without the approval of the annual conference. That's also a paragraph in the discipline. You seek consent of the pastor or the district superintendent to buy or sell property. And you include language per the IRS code for tax-exempt organizations in your charter if you're incorporating the church. And of course, if you're incorporating, you must include the trust clause in your charter. So, and then there's other things that the trustees should be aware of that I just want to kind of name. Some non-church programs, whether you have affordable housing, whether you operate a soup kitchen, a health ministry, a school in your, out of your church. And if these are things that have grown out of your ministry, you may actually want to consider incorporating those entities separately, again, to sort of protect your church and to allow them to operate a little bit independently from the board of directors, from the trustees of the local church. So with our remaining time, I want to talk about sort of the more ministry aspects. That's again, I worry about overwhelming people with the legality of being a trustee and all the property things, and I want you to be excited about the ministry opportunities. But before I do that, I want to take another quick break, see if there are questions about what we've covered so far.
When you were talking about the trust clause, someone wanted to know who is the grantor and who is the grantee.
Okay. So the grantor is the denomination, the United Methodist Church. The grantee is the local church. So let me go back to my note on that. And I know exactly that you're looking at that last paragraph where it says this provision is solely for the benefit of the grantee. I'm sorry. So I'm thinking I may have reversed that. This provision is solely for the benefit of the grantee, and the grantor reserves no right or interest in said premises. So the grantee is the denomination. You are. Make sure I'm sorry. It is confusing. I think I've confused myself on this. So the local congregation is granting trust to the denomination. And if I'm getting this backwards, we'll try to put that in the notes afterwards. But in other words, you are holding that property in trust for the denomination. And I'm sorry for the hesitation, but I know this is important to you, and I don't want to misstate it, because a lot of people look at this as kind of being something that is burdensome to the congregation, and that's not the intent. And really, it only usually comes up if a congregation is closing, is discontinuing business as a congregation. Then that property goes back to the denomination. In particular, it goes back to the conference trustees. That's not something that we as conference trustees like to have happen. It's not something we look forward to. We'd far rather the churches stay active, they stay in ministry in their communities. So let me get my legal mind together on just the terms of grantor and grantee. But understand that the overriding organization is the denomination. The trust clause is for the benefit of the denomination, that you hold that property in trust for the larger church that you are a part of. So.
Great. Well, one of the questions is then how transparent should the trustee proceedings be?
Wholly transparent, I would say. And in fact, as may have been referenced in other sessions, any meeting other than SPRC is an open meeting in the United Methodist Church. That means anybody who is interested could come attend a trustee meeting. They couldn't vote, but it is intended that any of these commissions, any of these boards, other than Staff Parish Relations Committee, are open and transparent to the congregation. That's something that you should desire to be. You don't want to have people second guessing what you're doing. Those reports that you make during your charge conference and to your church council are for your benefit, so that people are aware of what's going on. So I would say the answer to that question is you should be absolutely transparent, really only for your own protection, and also to make sure that you're doing what you want to do, which is really serve the best interest of your church.
Good. This will be a good transition into what you're going to talk about in relationship to ministry. The question is, can trustee funds be used for the church operations beyond maintaining the building, the assets, such as salaries, benefits, and program expenses?
So if you have a trustee's account, if you're talking about the trustees having their own separate funds, their own account, the trustees, you can vote, again, unless you have particular policies, and I encourage you to create policies about how a trustee's account can be used, about how it's funded, how money comes into that account, and how those funds are dispersed. So as long as you are following your rules, you can create rules that work for your church. The only thing you can't do is, as I said, use a bequest or a trust in a way other than the intent of the donor. So if your trustee funds are one of those bequests or one of those trusts that was set up for a particular purpose, no, you can't use that for a different purpose. But if you have a fund that is the trustee's account, that is the trustee's fund, and your rules for the use of that account allows something other than building use, then yeah, you can use that. But think about that as you develop your rules for how the trustee's account is used and how it's financed, about whether you want to keep that option open or whether you, in the best practice for your church, want to say, no, we really want to reserve those funds just for the building so that we have them available when we need it and that it doesn't get drained out. There's no, the Book of Discipline, the church doesn't give you a right or wrong on that. That's a policy that you want to create that, that serves your purpose as trustees.
Okay, so some of our churches have been around for a long time, and people have given to certain funds and certain ideas or dreams or visions that are no longer there, and the money's just sitting in the budget, and people are saying, oh, you can't spend that because the Johnsons gave that back in 1968 and it can only be used for that purpose. How do you navigate that?
As long as that money is invested and is returning income, you can use the income from that money for other purposes. That is something that I would really look at. There are legal ways to say, okay, those purposes are no longer, just to kind of set aside what we call restrictors. That has to be done, and I would seek actual advice from a lawyer, from an accountant, as to the proper way to set aside that restriction. It can be done, but it has to be kind of proven and it has to be established. So if that's something that if you really have got funds that have been sitting for a long time that really simply can't be used the way they were intended, consult an attorney, consult an accountant about how you can set aside, legally set aside the restriction. But until that's done, you really can't. You're really kind of limited by that.
I understand that the local trustees are subject to the charge conference. Are the trustees also subject to the local church administrative council in the same way?
The Book of Discipline only specifies that it acts under the authority of the charge conference. I think so. I'm not going to say as a rule that they are, but as practice, they should be. Again, your administrative board is kind of, and a representative of the trustees serves on that administrative board or church council. And that's really the board that wants to kind of govern the life of your church, govern the ministry of your church. So you really should be in partnership with them, and you really should be allowing the administrative board to kind of make these broad policies. As trustees, there's certain things that you do need to restrict that are of a legal nature, because you are going to be the ones to sign contracts, to hold property. So if there really are property things that relate to the deed, to the mortgage, to that, to those things you have to keep in your authority. But other kinds of things, you really should be working with the administrative board and the church council. So if there are other questions about sort of the specific duties, let me talk about a less black and white area. And let's talk about good stewardship and what you can do as a trustee to be a good steward of your property. So think about what that means of being a good steward. Think about what stewardship do your members need? It's easy as a trustee to be be reacting to needs, reacting to property, reacting to fixes, repairs, that kind of thing. But it's not only okay, it's really a good idea to take some time to think about, well, what can we do to kind of be in ministry in the church? What does our membership need? What does our community need? And how can we as the Board of Trustees begin to make that happen? St. John's, a church up the street from me, looked around and saw that their community needed healthcare. And so they set out to create a healthcare ministry that's in service to the community. In my church, we looked around, we're part of an arts and entertainment district that's publicly funding artists. And we said, okay, my community needs spaces for artists to do shows, to do performances. And so our trustees created a building committee that is working on developing our chapel, which is an underused space, as a resource for those arts communities in our neighborhood. So you can look at trustees about what does our community, what does our congregation really need that we maybe can react to, that we can maybe make plans for, that we can maybe support with our property and with the funds available to us. Think also about the message that you're sending to visitors or prospective members. And that's not an immediate obvious one, but think about somebody coming into your church for the first time. As they walk into the door, is it clear to them where they should go? Is it clear to them where the sanctuary is? Is it clear to them where restrooms are or a nursery? Is it clear where they can find hymnals or worship bulletins? The kinds of things that really make a congregation welcoming to a visitor or to someone who might be looking for a church. Think about what impression your building is making, what message your building is sending to people coming into your church for the first time. Is it welcoming? Is it easy to navigate? Is it the kind of place that someone coming in wants to come back to another time? Is it comfortable? Is it well lit? Do you have resources for people that may have difficulty hearing or difficulty seeing? Do you need to get large print bulletins and hymnals? All the kinds of things to really look at your church as if you haven't been there for 20 years or been there for your entire lifetime. If you're somebody coming there for the first time, do you feel welcomed? Do you feel embraced? And if you see any deficiency there, what is you as a Board of Trustees, what can you do to make that person feel like they're finding a new home? Also ask yourself, how are you caring for the legacy of your predecessors? Reverend Rodney mentioned, people that have made gifts over the years, over the generations. If you have a very old congregation, even if your congregation is not that old, the people that have come before you have had a certain vision, certain things that they have tried to do, certain things that they've built up within the church. How are you caring for that? Are you just kind of reacting to what you have in the moment? Or are you really looking at these resources that previous generations put before you and saying, how are we maintaining this? How are we improving upon this? How are we making that ministry really work for this generation and for the next generation? And maybe even make a hard decision to say, you know what, we really had a need for this 15 years ago, but right now we're spending money and resources on that could go to something that we really much more need in this way now. So be looking at that legacy that you're given and how you're taking care of that legacy, how you're using that legacy. Which then, of course, comes to the next point. How are you caring for the inheritance of the coming generation? You are the stewards of your children's and grandchildren's generation's church. You're going to be passing down to them a building, programs, resources, and how are you caring for the property that's going to belong to them? When they look back at decisions that were made in your time, will they be decisions that are helpful to them, that are enabling them to do the kinds of things that they will need to do in their time, that's not necessarily limiting what they can do, but also providing a good framework. So that constant kind of looking backwards and forwards, it's so easy to just really look at right now and what you really need to do right now, but be looking at the past, look at the future, and look at what your role as a trustee is in that, in terms of how you're dealing with that legacy and that inheritance. In addition to stewardship, I want you to think about ministry. And I touched on this point before, but I want to remind you and every lay person in the United Methodist Church that we are in ministry in partnership with our clergy past partners. So think about how you're in ministry. Think about what you're doing to support the ministry of your congregation, the goals of your congregation. And if you're not doing something that maybe you could do that would help make your building and your property a better facility for that kind of ministry. So what are your goals as a congregation? In fact, do you have goals? Or are you just kind of keeping the doors open, keeping the lights on, keeping the heat going? If you don't, I actually encourage you to have a goal. And maybe it seems like right now, that's not something that, maybe that feels like a luxury right now. Maybe you're really just kind of getting by, really just have the money to make ends meet. But don't let that stop you from having a goal, because goals can be a powerful thing. They can inspire congregations. We found when we started our renovation project back in the 90s, we didn't have the resources to make it happen. But once we put up scaffolding, once people saw plaster being put up, it inspired them, and donations came in and people were excited about that possibility, and it kind of spiraled. So if people see that you have a goal, if they see that you're working to something, that can really be the seed for something to grow. So if you don't really have goals for the future, even if you don't feel like you can make those goals happen right now, I encourage you to kind of create some goals, create a vision for what you want your congregation to be, the service that you want your congregation to be in, make that known, make that ever before you in terms of the decisions that you're making about your building and your property. And towards that end, what is your measure of effectiveness? And I want to specify that wording here, because I don't mean success, because success is an elusive term. And success applies that you've finished, that there's an end to something. And if we're in ministry, then we're not looking at an end to that. So you want to look at what is your measure of effectiveness. How are you being effective at what you are trying to do, at welcoming people into your congregation, at being good stewards for the people in your congregation, at being a resource for the community around you, at being in service to missions, whether it's UMCOR or childcare or things overseas, whatever it is that's important to your congregation. What is your measure of whether or not you're being effective at that? And are you attentive to that? Are you looking at those measures and saying, yeah, we really got towards that goal, or no, we didn't quite get to that this year. What do we do next year to really make people aware of what we need to do? So have that goal, but with your goal, make sure that you've got some measure of whether or not you're being effective at that goal. And then the last question that I want to ask you in terms of ministry is a point that I've hit a couple times tonight, is what is your relationship with your pastor? How are you working hand in hand with your pastor to be in ministry, that ministry to your congregation, to your community, to the larger community? What can you do as a board of trustees that supports what the pastor's goal and vision is for the congregation? What can the pastor maybe do to help you out? Really be working together in that. It can be a wonderful relationship when it works. If it's not working, it's probably a matter of communication. It's probably that you are not communicating effectively with each other, that you're not reaching an agreement about what those goals are. And sometimes it's not being willing to set aside what's important to you for being aware that the congregation as a whole may have other priorities at that time. And part of being a good Christian is having that humility to say, okay, maybe what I want is not the thing that we need to do right now, but I can help with this thing right now. So those are questions that I kind of want you to be thinking about as trustees. I encourage you to be more than just the people who react when the plumbing goes bad, or when the door hinges need to be replaced, or there's a broken pew. Really look at how you can be stewardships of your property, how you can be in ministry with your pastor and with your community, how you can have goals to be inspired and to inspire others, that your building is not just a roof over your head, that it's really a tool for ministry. And with that, I'll see if we have any other questions to wrap up our session this evening.
Although the state of Maryland does not require churches to have perpetual care funds for the long-term care of cemetery property, what are some pros and cons for the trustees to make provisions for this ministry of the church?
That's an excellent question. I didn't touch on this earlier, but church cemeteries are kind of a big deal. My church has a 33-acre cemetery, and the care of that occupies us a lot. And that's one of the points that I want to make, is that if you're not making provisions to care for something like a cemetery, then time and resources that you could be spending on ministry, you're spending on administrative things like property maintenance and property repairs. Absolutely, if it's at all possible, you should have a perpetual care fund, some kind of endowment for your cemetery. We actually encourage churches to look at separately incorporating your cemetery, creating a fund that would make that operate independently. Very unfortunately, on the conference trustees, when we get a church that closes, if that church has a cemetery, and there aren't resources to take care of that cemetery, it can be a bad situation, and it leaves people with a bad feeling for their relatives that may be there. So yeah, so even though it's not a requirement, it really should be something that you're giving a lot of thought to as trustees, is setting up that fund. And it can be daunting sometimes, because you can think, okay, well, we don't possibly have enough money to get that fund going, but don't let that stop you from at least starting. And even if you have to create a perpetual care fund or a trust or an endowment for that cemetery, that's just a token for now. Get it started. Give that as something that people can donate to. Make that a ministry that people are aware of. Don't neglect that cemetery. It's a really important ministry. You've got people and families that committed to your church and your property when they bought property there, when they interred their loved ones at that cemetery. So really take that particular duty very seriously and look at what you can do to kind of take care of that for the long term. It's an easy thing. It's something that when times get tough, people want to overlook first. Please don't do that. Please look at how you can take care of providing for that cemetery.
You have given us a wealth of information. This is a ministry for you. How do you find the time to do all the things that you're doing in this important ministry of the church?
It's when you make it a priority, you find the time. I can't give you a formula for finding it. I will tell you that I do prioritize that. I'll be quite honest. I'm not a rich person, and I find that what I can give to the church is time, is commitment, is one of the things that I can give as much as anyone. I find that when I make it important, and it is important to me, as Reverend Rodney has said, as hopefully you've seen in my voice tonight, this is something that is important to me. And so I find that because it is that I make the time. It's not easy. I'll admit there are times when there are evenings when there's another trustee meeting, another finance meeting, a Saturday work day to go out to the cemetery and cut back bushes, or to go to up into the attic of the church and clean out things there. It's not necessarily easy, but you do it. I do it for me. It's time that I enjoy, because I enjoy my congregation. I enjoy the people that I've gotten to know, both within the conference and all aspects of the church. I enjoy spending time with those people. I enjoy being in a ministry with those people. I feel good about the work that I'm doing to create these resources for creating disciples for Jesus Christ. And it really is a direct connection for me. And it maybe just sounds like I'm quoting the mission statement of the conference, but it really is vital to me, and I hope it's vital to you. I hope it's central in your image of who you are as a trustee, is that you really are providing the resources for that to happen. Buildings are important. They give people a sense of place. They shouldn't be all important, because the people are always more important. The congregation is still the focus of your church. But there's a comfort to buildings. When people see that, it represents something. It's when you can provide space in that building for people that need ministry, when you can provide an opportunity for people to come and give and support each other. There's just so much that comes out of that. I get so much out of it that it's frequently one of the places that I would rather be. And I hope that you find that would be the same for you.
Is it the business of the trustees to find out if their building has historical Meaning, being, presence. And is it a lengthy process to lead a church through that?
Again, you are allowed to decide what is important to you. For me, that history is important. I want to know that. Many churches have a committee that's, or a congregational historian that looks into that. Certainly, and I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here, but certainly your church records are important. And if you have, however far back you have baptismal records, marriage records, cemetery records, those are vitally important because that's people's link to the past. And that's a resource that's not just record keeping. That's how people connect to their families. It's so important that when a church closes, we bring those records to the archives, and we continue to get calls. People continue to look up those records. So take that stewardship of your historical records very seriously. That's a living link to the past of your church. But as to whether or not your building is historically significant, you're allowed to decide that for yourself. Just because it's important to me doesn't mean it has to be important to you. But if it is important, you can contact our commission, our local archives and history, see if they have any records that might help you. You can look at the state archives and state records, look in community records. Maybe there's histories and lessons of that. I do have to point out that our church rules prohibit you from seeking landmark status for your building. So even if you find that it is very old, that it is very historic, you're not allowed to independently go out and landmark your building. If that's something you want to pursue, you do need to get in touch with the conference trustees and talk to us about that and about that process, about whether that's something that's really in the best interest of the church to pursue. But your history can be as important as it is to you, whether that is something or whether you really just want to focus on your current ministry or on your future ministry.
What would you leave us with? We are just minutes away from closing out this time. What is the one thing you have given us such rich and experienced perspective on this important ministry of trustees?
Maybe the thing that when I've taught this class before, that often I've seen the reaction has been to be a little bit overwhelmed, and people actually maybe second guess their decision to be a trustee because it involves so many areas. I guess what I want to leave you with is the reverse. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't know that you don't have to take it all in one bite. In fact, one of the wonderful things about the church is that we ask lay people of all kinds of experience levels, to be trustees. And that word, think about that word trustee. It just means that you are entrusted with something. And just think about being worthy of that trust. Think about the care that's been placed in you, the care that you have the opportunity to present. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Take it in the steps that you're able to. Rely on each other, and really just appreciate that ministry and that opportunity you have to be a steward. And that term is a great thing to be a steward for this Bethel, this rock that God has given you.
Thank you, John. Would you pray us out, please?
Thank you. I'd be happy to. Heavenly Father, at this time, we come to you in gratitude for all that you have given us. You have given us places that are important to people, places that are tools for your greater glory, places that are a gathering space, a place of trust, a place of reassurance, a place to celebrate, and a place to praise your name. But even more than that, you have given us people who are willing to commit their time, their energy, their resources, their thought to your ministry, to how you are represented on this earth, how we serve you on this earth, how we serve you in our communities, how we can spread your word, how we can glorify your name, and how we can bring people closer to you through the resources that you have given us. Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for all that you have given us, and we are humbled by the trust that you have placed in us to be your ministers in this important work. We ask you to strengthen us. We ask that it always be your voice on our lips, that it always be your work in our hands, that it always be your steps that guide our feet. All these things we ask in the name of the one who saves and redeems us, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.